You think you can just sit there smirking like you didn't stab me in the back, Jimmy? Johnny Depp's voice sliced through the studio air, sharp as a razor, his eyes burning with a fury that made the audience gasp. The cameras rolled, capturing every tense second of the live broadcast. Johnny leaned forward in his chair, his leather jacket creaking, his hands clenched into fists on the polished desk. The crowd, expecting another lighthearted celebrity interview, sat frozen, their murmurs dying as the atmosphere thickened with hostility. Jimmy Kimmel, usually quick with a quip, seemed caught off guard, his smile faltering under Johnny's glare. The stage, bathed in warm light, felt like a pressure cooker ready to burst. Johnny's anger wasn't random. It stemmed from a wound that had festered for years, one Jimmy had unknowingly reopened with a careless comment earlier in the show. Months before, Jimmy had hosted a comedian who mocked Johnny's recent career lows, joking about his box office flops and legal battles. Jimmy had laughed along, even adding a jab about Johnny's washed-up pirate days. The clip went viral, and Johnny, already battered by Hollywood's cold shoulder, felt the sting deeply. He'd trusted Jimmy, a friend from the old days, when they'd shared drinks and stories at industry parties. To Johnny, that moment on air was a betrayal, a public humiliation dressed as humor. Tonight, he'd agreed to appear on the show, not to promote a film, but to confront the man who'd kicked him when he was down. Jimmy tried to recover, his voice smooth but strained. "Come on, Johnny, it was just a joke. You know how this works. You're a big star, you can take it." He leaned back, arms crossed, his grin more of a sneer. The audience chuckled nervously, unsure where this was going. Johnny's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening. "A joke? You call that a joke? You let that hack tear me apart and you piled on. You think I don't know what people say? That I'm done, washed up? You made it worse, Jimmy. You made it personal." His words dripped with venom, each one landing like a punch. The crowd shifted, some leaning forward, others clutching their seats, sensing a storm brewing. The show's producer, offstage, signaled frantically to cut to commercial, but Jimmy waved him off, his ego bruised. He wasn't about to let Johnny steal the spotlight. "You're blowing this out of proportion," Jimmy snapped, his tone sharper now. "You want to talk about personal? Maybe if you didn't tank every project you touch, people wouldn't have so much to say." The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed through the studio. Johnny's face darkened, his eyes narrowing to slits. He stood, towering over the desk, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to talk about my work like that. Not you. Not after everything I've been through. You think you're untouchable, sitting there in your fancy suit, mocking people who actually create something?" The tension was electric, the air crackling with unspoken grudges. Johnny's career had taken hit after hit, lawsuits, divorces, studios turning their backs. He'd clawed his way back, landing a small but meaningful role in a new indie film, hoping to rebuild. Coming on Jimmy's show was supposed to be a chance to show the world he was still here, still fighting. Instead, it had become a battlefield. Jimmy, sensing the crowd's unease, tried to pivot, his voice dripping with false charm. "All right, Johnny, let's calm down. Tell us about this new movie of yours. That's why you're here, right?" But Johnny wasn't having it. He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the stage floor, pointing a finger at Jimmy. "Don't play nice now. You opened this door. Let's walk through it." The audience was hooked, their eyes darting between the two men, the clash unfolding. Like a drama they couldn't turn away from. Johnny's pain was raw, his anger justified to those who'd followed his struggles. Jimmy, usually the charming host, looked smaller, his smugness cracking under the weight of Johnny's accusations. The stage was no longer a place for laughs, it was a showdown, and neither man was backing down. As Johnny's finger hovered inches from Jimmy's face, the producer's voice hissed through an earpiece, urging Jimmy to de-escalate. But Jimmy ignored it, his pride wounded, his own temper flaring. The confrontation was only beginning, and the world was watching. Johnny's finger trembled inches from Jimmy's face, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to suck the air from the room. The audience held its breath, caught in the raw intensity of the moment. Jimmy Kimmel, his smirk fading, leaned forward, his own temper flaring. He wasn't about to let Johnny dominate his stage. "You want to point fingers, Johnny?" Jimmy's voice was cold, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Maybe if you didn't burn every bridge in your personal life, you wouldn't be so desperate for a comeback. How's that messy divorce treating you?" The crowd gasped, a sharp, collective sound that rippled through the studio. Jimmy's words were a low blow, dragging Johnny's painful public split into the open, a wound still fresh from years of headlines and courtroom battles. Johnny's hand dropped, his face paling as if Jimmy had struck him. The divorce had cost him more than money. It had stripped away his privacy, his peace, and left him raw, vulnerable to the world's judgment. He'd fought to keep his dignity, to rebuild his life, only to have Jimmy fling it back in his face on live television. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some whispering, others staring wide-eyed, sensing the line that had just been crossed. Johnny's voice, when it came, was low, almost a growl. "You don't get to talk about my life like that. You don't know what I've been through. You sit here, safe in your little kingdom, throwing stones at people who've actually lived." Jimmy scoffed, his confidence returning, fueled by the crowd's uneasy energy. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his tone dripping with condescension. "Lived? Is that what you call it? Stumbling from one disaster to another? Come on, Johnny. The whole world knows your story. You're not a victim. You're a mess." The words hit like a slap, each one designed to wound, to undermine the man who'd once been Hollywood's golden son. The audience murmured, some shocked, others feeding off the drama, their attention locked on the two men. Johnny's chest heaved, his fists clenching at his sides, every muscle taut as he fought to keep control. Off stage, the producer's face was ashen, his hands waving desperately, mouthing, "Cut to commercial," to anyone who'd listen. But Jimmy, caught in his own ego, ignored the signals. He was the king of this stage, and he wasn't backing down. Johnny took a step closer, his boots scuffing the floor, his voice rising, thick with emotion. "You think you're clever? Don't. You? Hiding behind your jokes, your audience, your desk. But you're nothing without people like me, people you tear down to make yourself look big." The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps, some rooting for Johnny's defiance, others stunned by the raw hostility. It was no longer an interview. It was a war, and every word was a weapon. Jimmy's eyes narrowed, his smile gone, replaced by a hard, defiant stare. He stood, matching Johnny's height, leaning over the desk to close the distance. "You want to talk about tearing people down? Look in the mirror, Johnny. You've been doing it to yourself for years. Don't blame me for your failures." The audience was on edge, their murmurs growing louder, feeding the tension. Johnny's breath hitched, his control slipping as memories of lost roles, broken, trust, and endless scrutiny flooded back. He'd come here to reclaim his story, to show he was more than the headlines. But Jimmy was twisting the knife, making it personal, public, unbearable. The stage felt smaller, the space between the two, men crackling with unspoken challenges. Johnny's hands twitched, as if he might lunge, but he held back, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're not worth it, Jimmy, but I'm not letting you walk all over me. Not tonight. Not ever again." The crowd leaned forward, hanging on his words, the drama pulling them deeper into the clash. Jimmy, sensing he'd pushed too far but too proud to retreat, opened his mouth to fire back, his next words poised to escalate the fight to a point of no return. The studio was a powder keg, and the spark was already lit. Jimmy Kimmel's eyes glinted with malice, his lips curling into a sneer as he leaned closer over the desk, his voice dripping with scorn. Your legacy, Johnny? What legacy? A string of pirate movies that ran out of steam a decade ago? You're not an icon. You're a has-been clinging to scraps. The words landed like a gut punch, each one a deliberate twist of the knife, aimed at the heart of Johnny's pride. The audience gasped, their murmurs swelling into a low roar, some offended by Jimmy's cruelty, others feeding on the spectacle. Johnny stood frozen, his breath shallow, the weight of his career, decades of risks, triumphs, and now ridicule, crashing over him like a wave. The stage, once a platform for his comeback, felt like a trap. Jimmy didn't stop, his voice rising, fueled by the crowd's reaction. You walk in here acting like a victim, but the truth is, you burned out, Johnny. Hollywood moved on, and you're still chasing shadows. The crowd's noise grew jagged, a mix of boos and cheers, the tension so thick it seemed to choke the air. Johnny's face flushed, his eyes darting to the audience, seeing their faces, some pitying, some gleeful, mirroring the judgment he'd faced for years. He'd come to this show to reclaim his story, to prove he was still a force, but Jimmy was tearing it all down, reducing him to a punchline on live television. The producer, sweating off stage, was practically leaping, his hands slashing the air, begging for a commercial break. But Jimmy, drunk on his own power, ignored him. His focus locked on Johnny, daring him to crack. Johnny's hands unclenched, then clenched again, his body trembling with barely contained rage. He'd fought too hard, lost too much, to let this smug host rewrite his life. "You're wrong," Johnny said, his voice steady but laced with fire, cutting through the crowd's noise. "I built something real, something people still love. You just tear it down because you've got nothing else." The audience erupted, some clapping, others shouting, the room splitting between those who saw Johnny's pain and those caught in the drama's pull. Jimmy laughed, a harsh, barking sound that grated on the ears. "Real? You call those over-the-top costumes and slurred lines real? Give me a break." He waved a hand dismissively, as if swatting away Johnny's entire career. That was the final straw. Johnny's eyes flashed, and in one swift motion he turned, his boots stomping hard against the stage floor. "I'm done here," he said, loud enough for the microphones to catch, his voice carrying a finality that silenced the crowd. He ripped off his mic pack, the wires dangling as he tossed it onto the desk with a clatter, and strode toward the stage's edge, his leather jacket swaying with each determined step. The audience was stunned, their gasps turning to a collective murmur of disbelief. Jimmy's face froze, his smirk vanishing as he realized he'd lost control. "Johnny, come on, don't be dramatic," he called, his voice tinged with panic, but it was too late. Johnny didn't look back. He reached the stage's side, where the curtains loomed like a dark exit, and paused, turning just enough to lock eyes with Jimmy one last time. "You're not worth my time," he said, his words sharp and final, slicing through the studio's chaos. The crowd roared, some standing, others shouting his name, their energy a mix of shock and admiration for his defiance. Jimmy scrambled to regain the stage, his voice cracking as he tried to laugh it off. "Well, folks, that's Johnny Depp for you. Always a showman." But the words fell flat, the audience's focus on the empty spot where Johnny had stood. The cameras swiveled, catching the producer's frantic gestures, the crew's stunned faces, and Jimmy's forced grin, now brittle and unconvincing. Johnny's exit wasn't just a walk-off, it was a statement, a refusal to let Jimmy's cruelty define him. As he disappeared behind the curtain, the audience's cheers grew louder, a wave of support for the man who'd fought back, even if it meant leaving the stage. The curtain still quivered where Johnny Depp had vanished, his final words, "You're not worth my time," echoing in the stunned silence of the studio. The audience buzzed, their voices a chaotic mix of cheers, boos, and heated whispers, most directed at Jimmy Kimmel, who stood behind his desk, his face a mask of forced calm. The cameras zoomed in, catching the sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes darting nervously to the crowd. He'd miscalculated, pushed Johnny too far, and now the stage felt like a sinking ship, with him as the captain who'd steered it into the storm. The producer, offstage, was red-faced, shouting into his headset, but Jimmy raised a hand, signaling for the show to go on, determined to claw back control. All right, let's settle down, folks," Jimmy said, his voice strained, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow. "Johnny's just, being Johnny. Always a little dramatic, right?" He spread his arms, expecting laughter, but the crowd's response was icy. Scattered claps drowned out by murmurs of disapproval. A woman in the front row stood, her arms crossed, shouting, "That was low, Jimmy! You went too far!" Others joined in, their voices rising, a chorus of anger and support for the man who'd walked away rather than take more abuse. Jimmy's grin twitched, his confidence crumbling as he realized the audience wasn't on his side. Desperate to pivot, Jimmy leaned forward, his tone shifting to something softer, almost pleading. "Look, if I upset Johnny, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean to hit a nerve. We're all friends here." But the words rang false, his apology as thin as paper, and the crowd saw through it. Boos erupted, loud and unrelenting, rolling over the stage like a wave. A man in the back yelled, "You mocked his life! That's no friend!" The audience roared in agreement, their loyalty to Johnny palpable, fueled by his raw honesty and the pain they'd seen in his eyes. They'd watched his career rise and fall, his battles play out in public, and now they saw him as one of their own, someone who'd fought and refused to bow. Jimmy's hands gripped the desk, his knuckles, pale, his attempt to salvage the show unraveling. He glanced at the producer, who was gesturing wildly, mouthing, "Wrap it up," but Jimmy wasn't ready to quit. "Come on, people, it's a talk show. We have fun, we joke. That's the deal," he snapped, his voice sharp with frustration, betraying the charm he usually wielded so effortlessly. The crowd's boos grew louder, a few people standing, their faces hard with disgust. One shouted, "You're the joke, Jimmy!" The words stung, and for the first time Jimmy looked small, his authority slipping away as the audience turned on him, their cheers for Johnny's defiance still ringing in their ears. Offstage, the crew scrambled, unsure how to handle the chaos. The cameras panned across the crowd, capturing their defiance, their raised fists, their shouts of, "Johnny! Johnny!" It was a rebellion, not just against Jimmy, but against the machine that chewed up people like Johnny and spat them out. The audience, many of them older, understood struggle, betrayal, the weight of being judged. They saw Johnny's walk-off not as weakness, but as strength, a man reclaiming his dignity. Jimmy tried to speak, his voice rising over the noise. "Let's move on. We've got more show to do." But the crowd wasn't listening. Their energy focused on the man who'd left, their applause for him drowning out Jimmy's pleas. The stage manager rushed forward, whispering urgently in Jimmy's ear, likely begging him to cut to commercial before things got worse. Jimmy nodded, his face tight, and forced one last smile for the cameras. "We'll be right back, folks," he said, but his voice was lost in the crowd's chants, their voices a powerful wave of support for Johnny. As the show cut to a break, the audience kept chanting, their defiance a clear message. They'd chosen their side, and it wasn't Jimmy's. The studio was alive with their energy, the air thick with the promise of a reckoning, as Johnny's exit became a moment of triumph they wouldn't forget. The studio lights flickered back on as the commercial break ended, but the audience's chants of "Johnny, Johnny!" hadn't faded. Their voices rolled through the room, a relentless tide of support that drowned out the show's theme music. Jimmy Kimmel stood behind his desk, his tie slightly askew, his face a mix of frustration and forced composure. The cameras swung back to him, but the crowd's energy was elsewhere, their eyes fixed on the curtain where Johnny Depp had disappeared. The air crackled with defiance, the audience's loyalty to Johnny a living thing, pulsing through the studio. Jimmy's show, once his kingdom, was slipping from his grasp, and he knew it. He cleared his throat, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a cough. "Well, folks, that was quite a moment, wasn't it? Let's get back to the fun," he said, his voice too loud, too brittle. He shuffled some papers, trying to pivot to the next segment, but the crowd wasn't having it. A man in the middle row stood, cupping his hands to shout, "Bring Johnny back!" Others joined in, their voices merging into a demand that shook the room. Jimmy's smile faltered, his eyes darting to the producer, who stood frozen off stage, shaking his head in defeat. The crew looked lost, their usual rhythm shattered by the audience's rebellion. Jimmy tried again, his tone sharper now, betraying his irritation. "Come on, people, we've got a great show lined up. Let's move on." But the words were swallowed by boos, loud and unforgiving, the crowd's anger at his cruelty to Johnny spilling over. A woman near the stage pointed at him, her voice clear and cutting. "You owe him an apology, a real one." The audience roared in agreement, their applause a thunderclap of support for the man who'd walked away rather than take more abuse. They understood Johnny's fight, his years of being judged, his struggle to rise above the wreckage of his career and personal life. To them, he was more than a star. He was a survivor, and they were his army. Then a stir rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward the side of the stage, where the curtain parted slightly. Johnny stepped just into view, not fully back, but enough to be seen. He raised a hand, a simple wave, his face calm but resolute, his eyes meeting the audience's with quiet gratitude. The room exploded, cheers and applause shaking the walls, a wave of love and respect for the man who'd stood his ground. Johnny didn't speak, didn't need to. His gesture said everything. He was still here, still fighting, and their support was his strength. He gave a small nod, then slipped back behind the curtain, leaving the audience roaring, their voices a testament to his victory. Jimmy's face fell, his attempt at control crumbling. He sank into his chair, the cameras catching every second of his defeat. All right," he muttered, barely audible over the crowd's cheers, his voice stripped of its usual charm. He tried to start a new segment, introducing a guest, who shuffled awkwardly onto the stage, but the audience's energy was spent, their hearts with Johnny. The show limped on, each joke falling flat, each smile from Jimmy more strained. The crowd's chants had faded, but their message lingered. They'd chosen Johnny, not the man who'd tried to tear him down. As the show ended, the audience filed out, their faces alight with excitement, talking about Johnny's courage, his walk-off, his final wave. They'd seen a man refuse to be broken, and it moved them, reminded them of their own battles, their own moments of standing tall. Jimmy stayed behind his desk, the cameras off, his head bowed, the weight of his missteps heavy. The studio emptied, but the echo of Johnny's triumph remained, a story the audience would carry with them, a victory won not with words, but with the strength to walk away, and the love of those who stood by him.